All right, welcome everyone. So today our featured speaker is Ellen Bradley. She goes by she, her pronouns. She is a biologist and environmental scientist working for the Woodwell Climate Research Center. The research Ellen works on includes a study on how phytoplankton populations are influenced by tundra fires in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta and on monitoring permafrost thaw across the Arctic. Ellen is Tlingit and their views on environmental issues through the lens of her Indigenous identity. Ellen believes that Indigenous peoples are the original scientists of the land and must be leaders in expanding our understanding of climate change and our interconnected world. She hopes to focus her career on centering traditional ecological knowledge and the implications of scientific exploration on Indigenous communities. In addition to being a scientist, Ellen is a proud outdoor athlete for Native Outdoors, Protect Our Winters, and Deuter, as well as a ski ambassador for our in Washington local Crystal Mountain. She grew up near the Salish Sea and now works from Tulalip, Snohomish, Stillaguamish, and Coast Salish Territories, otherwise known as Everett, Washington. And with that, I'll be dropping a text of the bio in the chat if you need to follow along there. But otherwise, it's all you, Ellen. Thank you.
Gunesh Chish Ashley for the introduction. I'm going to try to share my screen. If there are any problems that come up, I probably won't be able to see the chat, so feel free to unmute yourselves. And also, I know we'll have a discussion at the end, but if there are any pressing questions, feel free to interrupt me. All right, does everyone see the screen? Awesome, we'll get started. Hello and welcome to this webinar, Gunesh Chish to those who have arrived in this space. My name is Ellen Bradley. I'm an enrolled member of the Tlingit tribe of Southeast Alaska. I'm the daughter of John and Kelly Bradley, granddaughter of Martha Person Bradley, and great niece of Dr. Walter Soboleff of the Tlingit Raven Dog Salmon clan of Kootsnoo-Kwan, aka Angoon, Alaska. I was born and raised by the Salish Sea in a town north of Seattle, Washington. From a very young age, I've connected most with my indigeneity while skiing. Being separated from my traditional homelands has been a large antagonist of my life. But the time I spend on the land skiing allowed me to connect with all my relations and develop a relationship to land where I was raised, especially with water. Most times when we think of water, we think of lakes, the rain, the places that our salmon swim. But when I think of water, I think of all those things and snow. Skiing is one of the ways that I connect most with water in all of its forms and allows me to see the world in all of its changing areas. I was a pretty huge nerd in school as a kid. I was fascinated with animals and I questioned absolutely everything. I always did pretty well in science classes and tried to take absolutely every science class I could in high school. And it was through these passions for the land, all of our relations, and my gifts within these colonized education systems that I decided to pursue the sciences. So when I attended college, I decided to use these skills to better listen to the land and advocate for Indigenous peoples and our rights and our views through these colonized ways. In the summer of 2019, I joined the Polaris Project, which is run through the Woodwell Climate Research Center. This is a project that studies climate change in Arctic environments. The Polaris Project gathers annually, usually in July, with a group of about 20 students that includes college students and scientists from throughout the United States. This project started many years ago, but since 2017, groups have traveled to a field site about 60 miles northwest of Bethel, where we spend about 2 weeks learning about climate change in the tundra, developing our own research projects and interests. And then we fly back out to Massachusetts, where the research institute that I work for is based out of, and spend another additional 2 weeks doing lab work, summarizing the data and the research that we've done, presenting it to a group of researchers, and developing research abstracts. So this is a map of approximately where our base camp is, 60 miles north of Bethel. And this is a view from above on a float plane of the campsite that we stay in for the 2 weeks. Slide. Before we go out to the research site, we try to have community meetings in Bethel. So I wasn't a part of the group of students my year that got to meet with KYUK to advertise this community meeting and to talk about the research, but I was a part of the community meeting that we had, where we brought in community members from Bethel to talk about the research that we were doing, to talk about research expectations, what Bethel community members are experiencing climate change firsthand, what are the biggest concerns, and also, in all honesty, the concerns of the Bethel community members that we were even there doing the research in the first place, which, as one of the only Indigenous students on this original trip, was a question that when it was presented, a lot of my white colleagues and non-Indigenous colleagues were really taken aback, but was one that I was honestly incredibly stoked was asked, recognizing the importance of questioning scientists and scientists who come into places that they are not from to do research. But when we were in this community meeting, the biggest concerns that kept coming up about climate change and how climate change was affecting the Bethel area and surrounding Yukon-Kuskokwim areas was all about fish. It was about salmon, how the rivers are doing, how climate change is affecting that, how the increased presence of tundra fires as a result of climate change are influencing that, how permafrost thaw is influencing that. Absolutely everything was about salmon. And that was something I could relate to as a salmon person myself. Being Tlingit, salmon is absolutely everything to me and my people. Salmon determines where we fish in the summer, where we go in the winter, what our activities are, how we prepare our food. And so concern over how climate change is influencing salmon was something that I could relate to, even though I'm not Yupik. So with that in mind, we headed out into the field, and I wanted to really focus on this question of how salmon are being influenced in the YK Delta. Unfortunately, the researchers that I'm with in this project are climate change researchers. They're focused on more atmospheric sciences, how the tundra is emitting carbon dioxide, and looking at permafrost thaw. And so I was kind of limited in this initial trip on being able to do the full extent of looking at how fish are doing in the area we were studying. And also the area we were in was not the largest fish run, especially not for salmon. So I pivoted my research project in order to focus on looking at the food web and the ecosystem of the aquatic lakes in general. And the best way that we could do that with the tools that we had at the time was looking at phytoplankton. So looking at the base of the food system and being able to look at that and determine how salmon and other different species above that might be doing. So we left Bethel, we took a float plane out to our campsite. And again, this is where we were camped for the couple of weeks. Now it's kind of harder to see in this image because it's really pulled out, but we have a really amazing GIS professor at Woodwell who develops these maps. And you can see in these red lines, these are burned areas that burned in a 2015 fire from January through July. And so this area in between this burned area here is actually where our campsite is. And so a lot of what the focus of different students' research is on is how looking at these burned areas, looking at the tundra, looking how that influences climate change. But I included this map to show exactly where our research site is compared to the river and the different communities. So when we show up at camp, the whole premise of the Polaris Project is that they're bringing in early career scientists to learn how to develop your own research questions. So typically there's about 10 college-age students that come in with a group of later career scientists who have their PhDs and are postdocs or PIs on the project. And the whole idea is to have each individual student come up with their entirely own question of what they are most focused on. So we spend the first 2 days while in camp developing these questions, walking around the tundra, and you're really experiencing it in a way that to me felt like the most Indigenous scientific experience that I'd had. Huge encouragement on spending time with the land and listening to the land and hearing what it is telling you, what speaks to you, and what is most important for you to pick up in those places. And knowing in this time that fish was something that I was really focused on, and walking around near where we were camping and seeing that that wasn't the best place to study fish, this is where I developed my idea around phytoplankton and studying that in the fires. So this is a really rough drawing. You can tell that I'm absolutely not an artist at all, and that's why I'm a scientist. But this is my rough depiction of looking at how I thought some of these different biological processes might be involved in this interaction between fire and phytoplankton populations. This was developed in relation to other professors that do work on aquatic ecosystem studies, so looking at carbon dioxide and oxygen level increases or decreases and how that might be influencing the population of phytoplankton, of the next level up of zooplankton, below microbes, invertebrates that live in the soil of the lakes, and really just trying to get a whole sense of how the ecosystem as a whole might be reacting to like the one or two elements that I was trying to identify in this. So here is another map of where we camped. This map again was developed by Greg Fisk, who is our GIS coordinator, and they have named this lake Landing Lake because it's where we land the float plane, but there's an effort that I don't know how much effort they've actually put in, but there's an effort to want to know if there's an actually big name for this place, and to include that and include the source of that information on these maps. But these are the lakes that we mostly do our studies on, and then you can see this outlines where there was a tundra fire that burned in 2015, where there's an unburned area, and that's kind of determined how we separate a lot of our research as you do. The unburned area we use mostly as a control for how the tundra functions as an ecosystem on its own without disturbance, and the burned area acts as the disturbance that we are researching. There was also this 1972 burn that's relatively accessible from where we camp, that when I go back this summer, I want to spend more time in those lakes looking at how over time the phytoplankton populations might compare to the burned lakes that happened in 2015. So for my project, what I wanted to study with the phytoplankton, we ended up doing an entire aquatic water kit for each of the lakes that I studied. So that took information on different nutrient levels, different levels of carbon dioxide, like a whole panel of the water chemistry of these lakes so we could fully understand what is happening. So when I started my fieldwork at each lake, we started with water kit sample, and then I would do my phytoplankton tows. And this is what I brought back to the Woodwell Climate Research Center with me to try to work on this idea of how phytoplankton populations are doing in the Arctic lakes. So I would do these tows with this phytoplankton net. I had my research partner, Lucy, drop the tow about 10 feet from where I was. I pulled it in, we let all the water drain out, and then we let just the phytoplankton, because they're held in by these filters, drop into this water bottle that then we froze and brought back to the Woodwell Climate Research Center with us. And here is a video of how these tows go. See if it will play. So as you can see, I throw the tow out like a Frisbee about 10 feet, and then I pull it back in to drag it around the water. Being that we were in the tundra for 2 weeks and didn't have all of the potential scientific gear that we might have, we kind of had to make a lot of the system up, and it certainly wasn't the most consistent thing. I was attempting to pull the tow at about the same rate each time I did it, but there certainly is a lot of potential human error involved in that. Overall, with what I accomplished in that, this is the paper, this is the poster that we developed. The results that we found through this research suggested that there were higher concentrations and populations of phytoplankton in burned lakes, so lakes that had a fire that burned the entire outer ridge, than in unburned lakes. And the reason we did so many of the water chemistry tests in each of these was to try to look at the different nutrient levels in the lake to see if there was a potential relationship to that. So my original hypothesis was that in these areas that had been burned, because the soil had all of this turning in the fire, that it would be more susceptible to nutrient runoff into the lakes. And so what we ended up finding was that there was a relationship between phosphate concentrations in the lakes and the phytoplankton populations. The higher the phosphate concentrations of the lake, the higher the phytoplankton populations. This is something that I want to go back in the summer and continue testing. There were other students on this project that were looking at nutrient runoff as a result of permafrost thaw rather than just burn. And so there could be this really complex relationship between all of these things. We didn't find any other relationships. There were no relationships between nitrates, which in general, phytoplankton populations typically have this really connected relationship with nitrate-nutrient relationships in lakes. And we found the opposite effect, which is really interesting for this area. There also was no relationship between ammonium, which is just another form of the nitrate cycle. The other really interesting part of this is there hasn't been scientific studies identifying the actual species of phytoplankton in these lakes. So in these samples that we took back, how we developed these concentrations is we put water through filters and then tested how much of this chlorophyll A, which is one of the products that phytoplankton produce, was in each of these lakes, which told us how much the population was. But with these also samples we collected, we attempted to identify phytoplankton on microscopes to try to get a sense of what the species diversities in these lakes might be. Now, I don't know how many of you have spent time thinking about or looking at phytoplankton, but you can look at these photos. They are really tiny and complex organisms. And I have previously worked on a research project where I identified zooplankton, which is the next step up in the food system. And zooplankton are themselves incredibly complex to identify. And so we just did an exploratory study where I spent many hours on a microscope picking through my samples and trying to see if there were any phytoplankton I could identify. And these were honestly the 2 out of the entire week-long exploration that I did that I could actually identify. And as I did further research, we found out that this is something that you usually pay a researcher outside of your institution a lot of money to spend a lot of time going through and that have that expertise to do. So this is something that I would love in the future to send these samples out to one of those experts to be able to get the sense of what the species diversity of phytoplankton in these lakes are, and be able to compare them between burned and unburned lakes to see if that might have an effect on species diversity. But it was something that was incredibly complex and maybe a little over my head to want to do at the moment when we were doing this research project. But overall, this research confirmed my hypothesis that tundra fires are impacting phytoplankton activity and populations, and that was displayed through an increase in chlorophyll A, or what the concentration is that phytoplankton produce through the process of photosynthesis in these lakes, and that these phosphorus and that the phytoplankton are probably more limited by phosphorus in these lakes, and that as a result of the fire, they're getting more access to phosphorus. So ultimately, this confirmed my hypothesis. So this project happened in the summer of 2019, and I was supposed to go back in the summer of 2020 and the summer of 2021 to continue working on this project. I wanted to keep working on understanding this, expanding to the 1972 lakes to get a better sense of how these phytoplankton populations might be doing over time in a larger time frame than just from between 2015 and 2019. But as we all know, COVID-19 hit, and that didn't allow us to go into the field for the 2020 or 2021 field season. And so since then, I have joined the Woodwell Climate Research Center as a research assistant, and I've kind of shifted my focus from aquatic ecosystems to looking at permafrost as a whole. So these are some photos from 2019 of what the permafrost status in a lot of these areas where we're doing our research looked. So this was a huge, what we ended up calling the crack, a huge cracked open part of the land that some of our researchers were looking at how deep it was, how much of it had thawed, and then also there was some research doing above and below, like what nutrient runoff might be looking at in these areas where the soil is so dispersed. And this is a photo of, you can see the depth that the permafrost has thawed, and that's cracked open, that we are just standing on the side of the tundra, and you can look in and see all of these different layers of soil without us coming in and disrupting them. So these are the more fun photos. This upcoming summer, I'm really excited to come back to continue this research project. I want to continue collecting data on phytoplankton in burned and unburned lakes, but this summer I will also be mentoring new students on aquatic sampling systems, on water chemistry, on phytoplankton. And I recently met a Yupik artist, Kachung, who was from Bethel. I was just up in Juneau working on a skiing project, and he was telling me that he's worked on fish studies in the area, looking at fish sampling in different areas of Bethel and along the river. And so I really want to connect more with him to bring in this element of fish that was my original interest of the project, and apply that to this to see how the levels of the ecosystem are doing, and be able to look at that as a further. I'm also really excited to come in and mentor new students. And there was a student on the program before I was on it, Darcy, who is Gwich'in, and she did a really great job of trying to encourage the Woodwell Climate Research Center to do a much better job of engaging with the Bethel community and really making sure to come in as respectful as possible, being that they've already established this program. And so I'm really excited to come in as a mentor on this and have Darcy be on this season of Polaris, so that the two of us can help continue pushing this forward and developing these community projects, and also keep working with the Yupik locals in order to make sure that this research project is done in a way that is respectful of Indigenous peoples, and doesn't continue contributing to the science that is very extractive that we've seen. And that is my presentation. Another thing that I would love to put up on the screen is my coworker, Darcy, has done a really beautiful job of producing this newsletter about the Polaris Project and what we've worked on previously. And this is something that I will share with Ashley and Clarita and Damaris so that you all can have, but this newsletter has a lot of more information on what the project is and what different students work on in the focus, but it's also produced in both English and in Yupik, which I thought was really beautiful, and think that that's something that should be more shared with the communities. And I think that Akia community especially should have access to this. So that will be something that is shared out as well for more information on the project. But I'm happy to take any questions or to have an open conversation now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ellen. We'll go ahead and stop the recording, and then we'll go ahead and switch into our talking circle for the remainder of today's webinar series. So let me just go ahead and do that.